Under the scorching heat of a Georgia sun, Governor Alex Carter, a towering figure in a sharp navy suit, stood beside his stalled truck on the desolate stretch of Old Mill Road. The quiet was broken only by the faint hum of cicadas and the dust rising in the distance. Waiting for the tow truck to arrive, he never expected that this ordinary moment would spiral into a nightmare. The silence shattered when a police cruiser screeched to a halt. Officer Jake Miller, a wiry figure with a sneer etched on his face, leapt out of the car, gun drawn, and barked, "Hands up, thief!" Alex froze, stunned. His truck, an old but well-maintained vehicle, was no crime scene. And yet, here he was, a respected public figure, the governor of Georgia, being accused of stealing his own property. As Officer Miller approached, the disdain in his eyes was palpable, his fingers tightening around his weapon. "Don't make me shoot you where you stand," the officer spat, his voice dripping with venom. The command hung in the air, thick with a hate that seemed to radiate from his very being. Alex's pulse quickened, but he refused to be intimidated. Slowly, he raised his hands, fingers spread wide, in an attempt to show compliance. His mind raced, his heart pounding, but he remained calm. "I'm not a thief," Governor Carter said in a deep baritone, his voice cutting through the tension. "This is my truck. Can you tell me why you stopped me?" But instead of an explanation, Officer Miller's lips curled back into a snarl. "Don't lie to me, scum," he sneered, stepping closer. "People like you don't belong in anything this nice. You stole it. Admit it. It wasn't about the truck. It was about him. The rich brown hue of his skin, his towering presence, his audacity to exist in a suit. A governor, a man who had fought to rise above his circumstances. And in that moment, Officer Miller couldn't see anything but the color of his skin. Despite Governor Alex Carter's calm demeanor and measured words, the tension in the air thickened with every passing second. The officer's eyes were wild, his hand trembling as it clutched the gun, his fingers itching for control. Alex could feel the heat of the Georgia sun scorching his neck, the sweat collecting on his brow as he stood there, hands raised, trying to reason with the officer who was increasingly becoming more unhinged by the second. "Listen," Carter said, his voice steady, but laced with a growing frustration. "This is my vehicle. I'm the governor of Georgia. Please check my ID." But before he could finish, Officer Jake Miller interrupted with a bark, his face twisted with disgust. "Shut your mouth, boy. I'm not here for your lies." The words stung like a slap, but nothing prepared Carter for what happened next. Without warning, Officer Miller lunged forward, a flash of anger in his eyes. Carter barely had time to react before the officer's hand slapped across his face, the force so sudden and brutal that it knocked his head to the side. The shock of it took a moment to register, but the pain was immediate, sharp. For a split second, Carter staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind racing. It was an instinctual response, a tightening in his gut, a desire to fight back. But he fought to stay calm, his years of navigating tense situations in the political world training him to stay composed. This wasn't about physical retaliation. It was about survival. But it wasn't just about survival from the officer in front of him. Carter realized in that fleeting moment that he was up against something far deeper, something systemic. Before he could steady himself, Miller grabbed him by the collar of his suit, yanking him forward with a force that left him gasping for air. "You think you're special, huh?" Miller sneered, his breath hot with the stench of tobacco and malice. The words were venomous, dripping with disdain. "Well, I'm gonna show you where you belong." With a violent shove, Officer Miller slammed Carter against the side of the truck, the metal searing against his skin through the fabric of his suit. The sharp pain shot through his shoulder, and for a moment he thought he might lose his balance. But he fought to stay upright, his chest heaving, heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't let this man break him. Not here, not now. "Get your hands off me," Carter demanded, his voice rising, but it was drowned out by the officer's harsh commands, without a moment's hesitation. Miller drove his knee into Carter's lower back, forcing him forward into the truck, the jagged edge of the door pressing against his ribs. The pain was immediate and searing, making it harder to breathe. The taste of dust and sweat filled his mouth as he tried to steady himself, trying not to let the officer's violence break him. He knew he had to hold it together to stay composed. The weight of his office, his position, his legacy. It all depended on his ability to rise above this. "Stop resisting," Miller shouted as he grabbed Carter's arms, yanking them behind his back. The sudden pressure on his shoulders was unbearable, but Carter clenched his jaw and fought to stay calm. This was not about him losing control. It was about getting through this alive. Miller was muttering under his breath, words that Carter couldn't quite make out, but the hatred in his tone was unmistakable. The officer's grip tightened on Carter's wrists as he snapped the handcuffs around his arms, the metal biting into his flesh with a vicious click. The moment the cuffs snapped shut, a chill ran down Carter's spine. His thoughts were racing. His training, his experience, the lessons in handling conflict, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for this kind of hatred, this kind of cruelty. The anger boiling inside him threatened to surface, but he knew better than to let it take control. His survival depended on staying calm, on not letting this officer's rage consume him. "You're under arrest for grand theft, assaulting a police officer, and resisting arrest," Miller said, his voice cold and detached as he moved back to admire his handiwork. The officer's words were a blur in Carter's mind, as his blood pulsed in his ears. But one word stood out: grand theft. Carter couldn't believe it. He was being accused of stealing his own vehicle, something so absurd, so detached from reality that it sent a wave of disbelief through him. He was a man who had fought through the streets of Atlanta, who had worked tirelessly to earn his place as governor of Georgia, and now he was being painted as a criminal. But it wasn't about the truck, it was about his skin, about the fact that Carter, a black man in a tailored suit, stood in front of a white officer who couldn't stand the sight of him. "Why are you doing this?" Carter asked, his voice low but steady, struggling to keep the panic from seeping through. "I'm not a criminal. I'm the governor. Please check my ID. You're making a mistake." But instead of listening, Miller grabbed the radio on his belt, his voice rising in triumph as he called for backup. "This is Miller. I've got a suspect in custody, a dangerous one. Found him with a stolen truck. Send backup to Old Mill Road." The lies spilled from his lips like venom, and Carter's heart sank. This wasn't just about one officer's prejudice. It was the system itself working against him. It was a cruel reminder that no matter how far he'd come, no matter how hard he'd fought to make it, there would always be people who saw him as less than human. That as the backup units arrived, Carter realized the full scope of the nightmare he was facing. He wasn't just a victim of a single rogue officer. He was caught in a system that had been designed to protect men like Miller. The truth wouldn't save him here. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second, And Carter knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with danger, with people who would stop at nothing to tear him down, and he could feel it in his bones. But he also knew something else. He would not be broken. Not by this officer, not by anyone. This fight had just begun. The ride to the precinct was a blur of flashing lights and the oppressive hum of the police cruiser. Governor Alex Carter sat in the back, handcuffed and silent, his body bruised and aching from the officer's violent treatment. The metal cuffs dug painfully into his wrists, the cold bite of the steel a constant reminder of his powerlessness in this moment. Outside, the world continued, unaware of the nightmare unfolding in the back seat. Carter's thoughts raced faster than the passing scenery. He had climbed the ranks of Georgia's political landscape, earned his position through decades of grit and determination. Now, sitting in the back of this cruiser, he was reduced to nothing more than a criminal. He couldn't believe it. His hands, though bruised, were still steady, his heart resolute. He knew the truth, but here, inside the system that was supposed to protect him, truth had no place. The officer's words echoed in his mind. Grand theft, assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest. Carter knew this was a lie. He was a victim of a narrative so deeply entrenched that even his own identification meant nothing. As they pulled up to the precinct, Carter took a deep breath. The building loomed ahead, a symbol of authority, yet it felt like a fortress built to keep him locked inside. The door to the cruiser swung open, and Officer Miller yanked him out with a rough tug. His feet stumbled beneath him, still adjusting to the weight of the cuffs and the disorienting mix of anger and disbelief that swirled inside him. Inside the precinct, things moved swiftly, but with the cold precision of a well-oiled machine, one that was about to grind him down. "Bring him to booking," Officer Miller barked to the waiting officers. Carter was shoved forward, his body stiff with the pain of being manhandled, but he held his head high. The officers at the desk barely glanced at him as they processed him, going through the motions of their work as if Carter didn't matter. He tried once more, his voice calm but firm. "I'm the governor of Georgia," he said, his gaze steady on the officer behind the desk. "Check my identification. This is a mistake." The officer looked at him, then at his ID with a dismissive sneer. "Sure you are," he muttered, barely lifting his eyes from the paperwork in front of him. "We'll see about that." It was a slap in the face. Carter could feel his throat tighten with a mix of frustration and disbelief. They hadn't even looked at his ID properly. They hadn't even considered the possibility that they were wrong. Carter was a man of laws, of order, a man who had built his entire career on the principle of justice. But here, in this place, that meant nothing. One officer snatched the ID from Carter's hand and flipped it over with a deliberate, mocking gesture. Then, with a twist of his wrist, he ripped the card in half, the sound of the plastic tearing loud in the room. A cruel laugh echoed from someone nearby. Carter's stomach turned. His identity, his entire life's work, was nothing more than a piece of plastic that could be torn and thrown aside in an instant. The officer didn't stop there. He tossed the pieces of Carter's ID onto the desk like garbage. The humiliation stung, but what cut deeper was the realization that this was never about a mistake. It was about power. And Carter wasn't in control here. Not anymore. "Look at him," one officer muttered, eyeing him from head to toe with disdain. "Big shot governor. Doesn't even belong here. Just another thief pretending to be important." Carter swallowed the anger rising in his throat. He could feel his chest tightening, but he didn't react. He couldn't. Not now. "What's the charge again?" another officer asked, flipping through a stack of paperwork in front of him. Carter could see them. They were flipping through pages, writing on forms, muttering amongst themselves. He was being dehumanized, reduced to a file, a name on a sheet of paper. "Grand theft," Officer Miller replied with a sneer. "Assaulting an officer, resisting arrest. You know, all the usual." Carter's mind spun. I didn't do any of those things, he said through clenched teeth. His voice was barely a whisper now, drowned out by the noise of their indifference. You're the governor, huh? Another officer said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Not anymore, you're not. The word stung, but the worst part was the cold certainty in the officer's voice. Carter knew it then. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. They had already decided what kind of man he was, and no matter what he said, it didn't matter. They were going to bury him under this false narrative. And they weren't going to stop until they succeeded. A bell rang in the distance, signaling the arrival of Carter's processing. He was led into a small, fluorescent-lit holding cell, the bars cold and unyielding in front of him. He was shoved into the corner, the walls closing in around him, and for the first time in his life, Carter felt utterly powerless. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing like a death knell. He sank to the ground, his back against the cold concrete. The weight of the cuffs digging into his wrists was the only thing that reminded him he was still alive. In the stillness of the cell, Carter closed his eyes. He could feel the anger welling up inside him, but he pushed it down. He had fought for this state, fought for everything he had, and now here he was, a man of power reduced to a criminal simply because of his skin. But as he sat there in that cell, alone and betrayed, a part of him knew this wasn't over. Couldn't be. No matter how deep they buried him, no matter how many lies they told, he wasn't going to let them win. The system was against him, but it hadn't broken him yet, and it wouldn't. Not ever. Governor Alex Carter sat in the dimly lit holding cell, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a vice. His wrists were still raw from the handcuffs, his face bruised from the slap that had knocked him off balance earlier, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the suffocating sense of helplessness that seemed to settle deeper with every passing minute. The walls around him felt like they were closing in, the sterile concrete seeming to close off his last shred of dignity. He had expected a challenge when he took office, but nothing had prepared him for this. Being framed, humiliated, and locked in a cell with the world outside unaware of the nightmare he was facing. The officers had already fabricated their story. Carter was nothing but a criminal to them, his identity stripped away, his achievements reduced to a mere lie. As the hours dragged on, the reality of it all began to sink in. The system, the very one he had spent his life working within, was now the one that sought to tear him down. But as he sat there, the faintest glimmer of hope flickered through the darkened room. A soft shuffle broke the silence, a figure moving between the cells. Miss Clara, the janitor, shuffled past, her mops and cleaning supplies clattering as she worked her way through the precinct's stark hallways. Her footsteps were slow, methodical, but something caught her eye. Her tired gaze flicked to the wall of Carter's cell, where something had been scratched into the concrete. She stopped, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the words, carved crudely into the stone. Governor Alex Carter framed. Officer Miller attacked me. Help. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew the significance of those words. As a longtime employee of the precinct, Clara had seen it all. The way the system chewed up people like Carter, the way power was manipulated behind closed doors. But she had also seen the governor on TV, seen his rise to power from the streets of Atlanta to the governor's mansion. The idea that someone so powerful, so dedicated to justice, could be reduced to this, it was hard to believe. But the truth was right there, scratched into the wall. She stood frozen for a moment, then a surge of adrenaline cut through the hesitation. She couldn't turn her back on this. Not this time. With shaking hands, she slipped her phone from her pocket, capturing a quick shot of the message. She couldn't risk being seen. Officer Miller and his colleagues were too powerful, too connected. They would silence her just as quickly as they'd silenced Carter. But she knew she had to do something. She had to make sure the world knew the truth. Without wasting a moment, Clara slipped out of the precinct and made her way to a payphone, dialing the number of James Turner, a local reporter known for his tenacity and his pursuit of the truth. He had been following the story of police misconduct for months, and if anyone could help, it was him. James, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. I've seen something. It's bad. They've got the governor locked up. He's been framed. I've got proof. She told him everything. The message she'd found, the mistreatment of Carter, the officer's actions. James listened carefully, his voice sharp with concern as he promised to look into it. "I'll get someone over there. Don't worry, Clara. We'll make sure the truth comes out." Within hours, James Turner was at the precinct, slipping past the guards and into the holding area, his camera ready. He didn't expect it to be easy, but he did expect a fight. And fight he would. The truth was on his side. But when the story broke, Governor Carter's struggle didn't end with a public outcry. No, it was just the beginning of a battle that would test his resolve and his belief in the very system he had worked so hard to build. The court proceedings were swift, but the room felt suffocating. Judge Robert Payne, a figure as crooked as the system he upheld, presided over the case with an air of indifference. Carter could feel the disdain rolling off the judge as he took his seat. "Governor Carter," the judge said, his voice cold and detached, "it's a shame to see you in this position, but you must understand, I can't allow your claims to interfere with the proper functioning of the law. We need facts. We need evidence." Carter's lawyer, a young, nervous man named Ellis, stood up to argue the case. "Your Honor, we have irrefutable evidence that the charges against the governor are false. The officer involved has a history of misconduct, and we have witnesses ready to testify that Carter was wrongfully detained." But Judge Payne wasn't having it. He waved his hand dismissively. "Witnesses, you say? You can't expect me to believe everything you've heard from some biased sources. This is about the law, not political posturing." It was clear now. Judge Payne was part of the system Carter had fought so hard to change. Payne had ties to the very officers who had wronged him. His allegiance wasn't to justice, it was to the power structure that had always protected its own. Carter's words fell on deaf ears as Carter took the stand. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew he couldn't back down now. "I am the governor of Georgia," he said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I did not steal that truck. I did not assault anyone. What happened to me wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate act of violence, a targeted attack based on nothing more than the color of my skin. This system is broken, and I'm here to prove it." But Judge Payne wasn't moved. He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're playing a dangerous game, Governor. You may be able to rally the press, but that doesn't change the facts. This court will not be swayed by your political agenda." The words stung, but Carter refused to back down. He could see the writing on the wall. The system, the very one he had worked his whole life to support, was now working against him. No matter how much truth he spoke, no matter how many lives he changed, he was just another black man in a corrupt system. The judge's gavel came down with a deafening crack. "Case dismissed," he said coldly. "This court will not pursue the matter further. The charges stand." The room fell silent. Carter stood there, his stomach twisting, as he realized just how deep the rot ran. The truth, his truth, didn't matter in this courtroom. Justice didn't matter in this courtroom. As the doors to the courtroom swung open, Carter walked out, the weight of his defeat settling heavy on his shoulders. He had come here for justice, but instead, he was greeted with nothing but contempt and betrayal. Carter had never felt so powerless in his life. The walls of Governor Alex Carter's temporary safe house felt like they were closing in on him. The small cabin tucked away in the woods, once a place of refuge, had quickly become a target. The previous day's events had taken their toll. His bruised body, the sting of betrayal, the sound of the judge's gavel sentencing him to nothing but further injustice. But the worst was yet to come. Despite his victory in the courtroom, the fight was far from over. Officer Jake Miller, enraged by Carter's defiance and the public exposure of his corruption, wasn't ready to let go. In his mind, Carter wasn't just a political adversary, he was a threat that had to be erased. Miller had always operated within the law, bending it to his will. But now, he had lost his badge, his position, but not his connections. He would not rest until Carter was broken, and nothing could stand in his way. The phone call came at midnight. Miller was speaking to someone, his voice low and filled with a dangerous resolve. "Get the militia ready. Carter thinks he's safe, but he's not. We're going to finish this. Tonight. And so it began. Under the cover of darkness, Miller unleashed his plan. Loyal to his every word, a ragtag militia, eager to prove their allegiance to Miller, began to mobilize. Armed with rifles and heavy artillery, they made their way to the cabin where Carter was hiding. At first, there was just the faintest sound, the crunch of gravel under heavy boots, the whisper of rifles being loaded. But then, the distant thud of a car engine broke the night silence. Carter's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening as he listened for the approaching sound. The house, isolated in the woods, was his last line of defense, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it. The air had changed, thickened with a sense of impending danger. He stepped to the window and peered out. Nothing, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. The night felt too still. Then, just as his gut warned him, the first explosion shattered the silence, sending a tremor through the ground. The sound was deafening, like thunder, like the sky itself had cracked open. Carter's heart raced as the sound of boots pounding on the ground outside grew louder. They were coming. They were already here. In the chaos, Carter scrambled to move. He had to think fast. His mind raced through every possible option. Escape wasn't an option. He had to protect those inside, especially Tyler, the young man who had been helping him since he'd gone into hiding. Tyler had no idea what he was getting into when he offered to assist Carter. He was just a kid, caught in the crossfire of a battle that wasn't his to fight. The militia had arrived. The first burst of gunfire hit the cabin's wooden structure with a sickening crack. Splinters flew as bullets pierced the walls. Carter knew he had to act, but the weight of the situation settled in his chest. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the life of a young man who had unknowingly become part of this dangerous game. "Get down!" Carter shouted, grabbing Tyler by the arm as the kid froze in shock. The walls reverberated with the deafening sound of another volley of shots. "Where do we go?" Tyler's voice cracked, panic rising in his throat. Carter didn't hesitate. "Stay low. The back door. We can't fight them off in here." They ran, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging through their veins. Carter shoved open the back door, the cold air rushing in as the two of them dashed into the night. Every step felt like it could be their last. Tyler stumbled, almost falling in his panic, but Carter was there, pulling him up, urging him forward. They had to get to the woods, where they might find some cover. The gunfire continued, the sound of chaos surrounding them as the militia advanced. Carter's mind was racing, trying to think of a way to stop this madness. He couldn't let these men take Tyler. He couldn't let them win. Suddenly, a voice rang out, distorted by the roar of the guns. "We've got him now! Get Carter. He's the one we need." It was Miller. His voice was unmistakable. He was orchestrating this, using his militia like pawns in a game of destruction. Carter could feel the weight of his gaze even from a distance. He wasn't just a pawn to Miller. He was the final piece to a cruel plan. They were closing in. Tyler yelped as a bullet grazed his arm, the force throwing him off balance. Carter didn't think. He reacted. He dove, covering Tyler with his body just as another round of bullets flew over their heads. Pain flared in Carter's side where the bullet struck. The agony was sharp, but he held on, gripping Tyler tightly, refusing to let go. "They're going to kill us!" Tyler cried, panic lacing his voice. "No," Carter said, his voice steady, even though every fiber of his being screamed in pain. "We're getting out of here. Do you hear me? We're not dying tonight." But as the militia closed in, the odds seemed insurmountable. Carter felt his strength waning, the pain in his side growing worse by the second. He had to get Tyler to safety. He had to finish this. A crackle from a nearby bush, and Carter saw a shadow move. His heart skipped. It was Miller stepping into view, a smug grin on his face. His men surrounded them, rifles raised, closing in. "Nowhere to run, Governor," Miller sneered, his eyes full of hatred and triumph. "I've won. You've lost." But Carter's gaze never wavered. The fire inside him wasn't out yet. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, loud, growing louder, like a lifeline in the storm. Carter's mind raced. He wasn't finished yet. "Get down!" shouted a voice. Suddenly, state police burst into the clearing, rifles raised, taking positions around the militia. The chaos erupted into a deadly dance, bullets flying in all directions. Miller snarled, fury on his face. But it was too late. The militia, caught off guard, scattered as the police fired back. Carter, breath ragged, kept his eyes on Miller, who was now pinned to the ground by officers. The victory, however small, felt sweet, bittersweet. The adrenaline slowly began to wear off, leaving Carter with the pain that flared in his side. But he couldn't focus on that now. Tyler was safe. They had made it. Miller was taken away in cuffs. His smug grin replaced with a look of bitter defeat. Carter finally allowed himself to breathe. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't done yet. He wouldn't stop until justice was served. The militia had failed. Miller had failed. And now it was time to make them all pay. Governor Alex Carter stood in the center of the clearing, every inch of him bruised, battered, and drenched in sweat. The pain from his side, where the bullet had grazed him earlier, was excruciating. But it was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on his chest. The militia, led by Officer Jake Miller, was closing in. Every movement was deliberate, every step taken with intent. They thought they had him cornered. They thought this was it, the final battle, the end of his fight for justice. But Carter knew something they didn't. This fight wasn't about the body, it was about the will. And his will would not break. He had seen the worst of humanity in the last few days. Betrayal from the system, from those he had trusted to uphold the law. He had been dragged through the mud, torn down, and humiliated. He had seen Tyler, the young man who had just wanted to help, caught in the crossfire of a war he never asked for. But Carter wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been pushed down, silenced, and forgotten. For Tyler, for every soul who had been ignored and mistreated. For himself, for his dignity. Miller's voice cut through the still night air, dripping with venom. "You think you've won, Carter? You think you're special, huh? I'm going to enjoy watching you burn." His eyes gleamed with the madness of a man who had been defeated but was still too proud, too angry to accept his loss. Carter straightened, forcing himself to stand tall despite the crushing pain in his body. He knew Miller was right about one thing. He wasn't just another politician. He wasn't just a symbol. He was a man who had endured, who had fought against the odds his entire life. And he wouldn't let Miller or his militia take that away. Behind him, Tyler was crouched low, trembling, his face pale. Carter could see the fear in the young man's eyes, but also something else. Something raw, something powerful. Tyler wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was standing his ground, just like the man who had become his protector. Carter's heart swelled with a fierce pride. Tyler would be okay. Carter would make sure of it. "I'm not your enemy, Miller," Carter said, his voice carrying through the night. "I never was. You made me one when you decided to destroy me. But I'm not going to let you take anyone else down with you. Not tonight. Not ever." The sound of distant sirens reached their ears. The cavalry had arrived, but it was too late for them to prevent the storm that was about to break. Miller sneered and raised his gun. His militia did the same, the sight of their weapons glinting in the moonlight. But just as Carter felt the familiar panic of danger closing in, something in him snapped. He wasn't going to die like this. Not in the woods, not at the hands of these men, not with his fight unfinished. He had survived too much. He had risen too high to let it all end in a single violent moment. "Run!" Carter shouted to Tyler. "Get to the trees. I'll hold them off." But Tyler didn't move. He shook his head, eyes wide with fear. "No, Governor. I'm not leaving you. I won't run. We fight this together." A wave of emotion hit Carter like a physical blow. This young man, this kid, was willing to die for him. It was the moment he realized that the battle was never just about him. It was about the strength of all the people who stood with him, who believed in what he stood for. And that belief, it was more powerful than anything these men could throw at them. Just as Miller aimed his weapon, ready to fire, Carter moved. His movements were a blur, his exhaustion pushing him forward like a wave crashing against the shore. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He lunged, grabbing Miller by the wrist and twisting, throwing his weight into the officer's body. The gunshot rang out, but it missed, the bullet slicing through the AI. In that moment, Carter realized something. The fear that had once gripped him had faded. He was no longer afraid. Not of Miller, not of the militia, not of the pain or the suffering or the uncertainty of what would come next. He had already made his choice. He would survive. He would rise. A struggle ensued, brutal and fast, as Carter and Miller fought hand to hand. The pain in Carter's side flared with each movement, but he kept going. With a sharp twist, he knocked the gun from Miller's hand, sending it skittering across the dirt. In a single, decisive motion, he took Miller down, pinning him to the ground, his knee pressing into the officer's chest. "I won't let you do this to anyone else," Carter said through gritted teeth. His voice ragged but strong. Miller struggled beneath him, his chest heaving with rage. "You think you've won, huh? You think this is over?" "It is," Carter replied, his voice steady. "You're done, Miller." Just as Carter held Miller down, the sound of heavy boots pounding the earth filled the air. State police swarmed the area, guns raised, shouting orders. Miller was quickly subdued, cuffed, and hauled to his feet. His militia, seeing their leader fall, scattered into the night like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Carter stood, his body trembling with exhaustion, his chest heaving as he looked around at the aftermath of the fight. The sirens, the flashing lights, the officers now in control. It was over. Miller was no longer a threat. His militia had been dismantled, but the damage they had done, the scars they had left behind, would never be erased as Miller was dragged away. He turned his eyes on Carter, a sneer still twisting his lips. "You won't get away with this. This isn't over." But Carter didn't flinch. "It's over, Miller. You're done." In the silence that followed, Carter's thoughts turned inward. His body was battered, his spirit bruised, but something deep inside him was unbroken. He had fought back. He had survived. And as he looked over at Tyler, standing a few feet away, his face filled with admiration, Carter knew that this fight, for himself, for Tyler, and for everyone who had stood by him, was far from over. But it was a fight he would win, because Carter knew something that Miller never would. True strength isn't about the battles you win. It's about the battles you keep fighting, no matter how much they try to break you. Governor Alex Carter lay in a hospital bed, his body bruised and battered, but his spirit, though weary, was unbroken. The room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of machines and the rustling of nurses as they moved about their tasks. He stared out the window at the distant city skyline, the same skyline he had looked upon countless times before, only now it seemed distant, almost unreachable. His side still ached where the bullet had grazed him, and his ribs burned with every breath. The wound on his shoulder had been stitched up, but the physical injuries, though severe, were nothing compared to the scars that would last forever, the emotional and psychological toll of the battle he had just fought. But despite the pain, despite the setbacks, Carter knew this was not the end, that he had faced what many had only heard about in the stories of others: the crushing weight of systemic oppression, the racial injustice that pervaded every corner of society, and the betrayal from those he had trusted most. But Carter had also faced something far more powerful: the will to survive, the will to rise above the darkness, no matter how deep it seemed. As he lay there, reflecting on the past few weeks, he thought about Tyler, the young man who had risked everything to stand by his side. Tyler had no political ambition, no power to wield, yet he had chosen to fight for what was right. His bravery, his willingness to stand up against the system that sought to break Carter, had been a reminder of why this fight mattered. The phone on his bedside table buzzed, breaking his thoughts. Lena, his aide, was on the other end, her voice crackling slightly through the receiver. "Governor," she said, her tone serious but hopeful. "I wanted to let you know. The story's spreading. The media's picking up the investigation into Miller and his militia. Public support is growing. But Miller's not done yet. He's escaped custody." Carter closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the news press down on him. Miller, the man who had tried to destroy him, was still out there. But Carter wasn't surprised. He had known from the beginning that the battle would not be over just because the enemy was temporarily defeated. This was about more than just one man. This was about an entire system that needed to be torn down and rebuilt. It would take time, courage, and resilience. And he would not give up. "I'm not backing down," Carter said, his voice steady. "Tell the team to keep the pressure on. We'll keep fighting. For justice, for the truth, for everyone who's been silenced." In the days that followed, the media coverage surrounding Miller's escape and the ongoing investigation continued to grow. The fight for justice was far from over, but it was gaining momentum. Carter knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The road would be long, filled with obstacles, setbacks, and challenges. But it was a road worth traveling. He had seen the darkness, but he had also seen the light. He had seen the people rise up, his supporters, his friends, and even strangers, coming together to demand change. It was a moment in history that couldn't be ignored. Carter's fight had become a symbol of something greater than himself. As he recovered, Carter began to think about the lessons he had learned through his ordeal. Justice was not a gift. It was a struggle, a fight that required every ounce of strength a person had. And even when the system was stacked against you, even when it seemed like the fight was futile, you had to keep going. You had to keep fighting, not just for yourself, but for those who came after you. The injustice he had faced was not unique to him. It was a reality that millions of people lived every day. The difference was that Carter had the power, the platform, and the will to stand up and speak out. And that, in itself, was a responsibility he would never take lightly. In the days and weeks that followed, Carter's resolve grew stronger. The media kept the pressure on, and Miller's escape was met with widespread outrage. The momentum for change was building. But Carter knew this wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who had been pushed to the margins. All the people who had been denied justice simply because of the color of their skin, the circumstances of their birth, or the place they came from. His fight was their fight. Carter wasn't just recovering physically. He was recovering his purpose. He knew now, more than ever, that he could not let the struggle for justice fade into the background. It had to remain at the forefront, driving everything he did. The journey would not be easy, and there would be more battles ahead, but he would continue to push forward, no matter the cost, no matter the obstacles. This was a journey of resilience, a journey of truth, and above all, a journey of hope that as Carter sat up in his hospital bed, looking out at the world beyond the window, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. You can be a part of this fight too, by supporting those who are committed to justice, by staying informed, and by standing up for what's right. We can make a difference. Governor Carter's journey shows us all that no matter how big the system is, no matter how much injustice there is in the world, we must never give up. We must never stop fighting. That if you believe in justice, in truth, and in the power of standing up for what's right, subscribe to our channel and share this story. Let's continue the fight together, because the journey is far from over, and it's one we must walk side by side. Remember, the fight for justice is a long one, but with your support, we will keep moving forward, one step at a time. Stay with us and let's make a change. Together.